was once a young woman who was a very talented spinner. And her cottage was where the river meets the forest. And every day she would spin, and she would spin, and she would spin. Not with a spindle this time, but this time with a wheel. And on this particular day, she was spinning hemp. Hennep, as you guys would say. And as I say when I'm speaking Dutch. And there came a visitor, and he wasn't a desired visitor at all. He was the count of that area, and he was a brutal man, a horrible man. He would make people work all day. He would make them work without shoes, and if they didn't work, he would beat their backs until they were bloody. And he was known everywhere as the wolf. And the young woman saw him approach, and he said to her, "If you come to my castle tonight," the flames of desire rippling through his body, through his veins. He said, "If you come to my castle tonight, I will make you a maid in my wife's chamber." "No, thank you," said the reply from the young woman whose name is Renelda. He said, "No, I'd rather not. I have my spinning to do, and my grandmother is sick, and I must care for her." "Ah," said the count, and he marched off. And then, a day later, came the count again. He said, "Where were you last night?" And she said, "Well, I told you I had my grandmother to care for." And he said, "If you come to my castle tomorrow night, I will make you the maid of honor in my wife's chamber." And she said, "No, thank you. I have my spinning to do and my grandmother is still sick." And so he came back the next day. And he said, "If you come to my castle, I will divorce my wife and you can have the castle, everything. All of this will be yours. Just come." And she said, "No, thank you. My grandmother is sick and I have my spinning to do." And so she span. And she span, and she span, and she span. She had hoped that she had got rid of the count. But she wasn't to be so lucky. I must tell you, also, in that part of the world, every bad thing that the count did, the countess would do her best to undo. So the people that were harmed would be given medicine. They'd be brought food. And as much as the count was hated, the countess was universally loved. Short time later, the count came back, and this time, Renelda was spinning linen. She was spinning flax. And as the thread was passing through her hands, the thread that would be woven, that would be cut, that would be sewn, the count said, "What is it that you are spinning?" And she said, "I'm spinning myself a shirt for my wedding day, if you'll permit me to be married." For in that place also, only the count could give permission for people to be married. And he said, "Please spin your shirt. And on the same day, you can spin a funeral shroud for me. And on the day I'm lying in my grave with that shroud on me, then you can be married. Oh, and one more thing. You must spin both the shirt and the shroud out of nettles." Renelda was shocked. She walked into her cottage and she saw her beloved. He walked in. His name was Gijs, and he was a lumberjack. And he said, "Well, why don't I just chop off his head and be done with it?" She said, No, the countess is our friend. We mustn't do that." She didn't know what to do. No one had ever heard of nettles being spun in that part of the world. And then a voice croaked up. It was an elderly voice. And it was the mother of her grandmother. And she said, full authority, "If the spirit wills it, the spinning of nettles can be done." And so she trusted that voice. And she went out to the graveyard where the nettles grew, and she cut all the nettles down, and she brought great sheafs of them inside, and the nettles were crushed. Then they were combed and made ready for spinning. And would you believe it? As hard as it seemed, the nettles produced a thread. And so she span. And she span, and she span, and she span. And in quite a short time, it had been spun, woven, cut, into a beautiful bridal shirt. And who should come by but the Count? And the Count said, well, how are you getting on with that shirt? He said, well, it's pretty much ready. He said, well, you better get on with the funeral shroud then, hadn't you? He said, quite shocked that she'd managed to get so far with this task. And so she began. And as he walked away, the Count felt something like a shudder, a shimmer, as though someone were walking over his grave. And he went back to the castle and he was sweating and his body felt painful and he started to feel sick. And then he was took to his bed and there was no remedy that any doctor could find for him. And he started to get blotches on his face, and it was then he realized what was the cause of all this. And so he sent 2 guards to Renelda as she was there spinning. And they walked up to her and they picked her up by the shoulders. They tied her hands, they tied her feet, and they marched her off to the river and they threw her in. And as she was lying under the water, not knowing what to do, how she could get free, the river itself freed the bonds around her wrists and her feet. She struggled up to the bank, made her way back to the cottage, and kept spinning. She span and she span and she span. And the next day, the guards came again. And they picked her up by her shoulders, they bound her hands, her feet, and they also tied a stone around her neck. And they threw her into the river. And as she was lying there, just struggling, you all right?
Yeah.
You're all right.
Sorry.
It's all good, not to worry. And as she was lying at the bottom of the river, struggling for breath, the river loosened the bondage around her wrists, around her feet, and around her neck, and she struggled up to the surface, walked her way, made her way back to the cottage, and she kept on spinning. And the next day, the Count arrived, and he was being carried on the guards, and he was looking so wan, so thin, so fragile. And he demanded that her spindle be broken. But the next day, the spindle was mended, and then he demanded that the nettles everywhere, from the graveyard all the way around, be pulled up. And so all the nettles were pulled up, and you couldn't find a nettle for miles around. And as Renelda sat in her cottage with the spindle, with the mended spindle, and she was spinning and spinning, coming to the last of the nettles, they started to grow all the way around the cottage and even up through the floor of the cottage itself. So she span and she span and she span. And then there came a knock on the door. It was the Countess. And the Countess said, I know why you're spinning, and this is totally your own choice, your own will to do it. This is how much power you have in you. But there's another power that I'd like to share with you, and that is the possibility that my husband could change his mind of his own volition. Will you allow that? Will you allow that chance that he could do differently? And she looked into the Countess's eyes, who was so full of love. And she'd known how good the Countess had been to her and her family. And so she relented. And that night, her beloved came to the cottage and he said, why aren't you spinning? It's the only way that we can marry. If he is to die, and then we can be married. She said, I can't, and I won't. The Count recovered his strength. And there were no more messages from him after that. But also, there were no more visits from Guibert anymore. So Renelda sat in this half-life, not being married, not being able to leave, not being able to do what she most wanted to do, which she wanted to marry her husband, her betrothed. And Guibert wouldn't come back. He was furious. And Renelda's heart broke as she heard the news that he had left town. Long, long time. And years went by. 1 year, 2 years, 3 years. Renelda's heart grew heavy and she would just make her way each day, just through the sadness, spinning, spinning, spinning hemp, spinning linen, whatever was required. And then one day, there was a knock on the door, and the door swung open. And there was the Count. And the Count once more was incredibly sick. And he said, I've learnt some things about power, and I need you to relieve me of this pain. I've done terrible things. Please, 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 please spin again. I only wish to be lain in the ground. And so, Ronaldo watched him leave, heard him go up the track, sat down at her wheel, and started spinning. She span, and the spinning was taken, and it was woven, and it was cut, and it was sewn into a beautiful funeral shroud. And the next day, the Count passed out of this life and into the next one. This beautiful shroud laid across his chest, a smile of contentment on his face, and that shroud woven completely out of nettles. Ronelda made her way back to her cottage. And there she sat, wondering what the future could hold for her. Just at that moment where she didn't have any thought whatsoever, no idea about what life could hold, there was a knock on the door, and it swung open. And standing there was Guibert. And after a difficult conversation, they were married. And I've heard that they're married still.